Cary Stayner lived in the shadow of his brother, Stephen Stayner, whose kidnapping and miraculous return made headlines across America. While Stephen was celebrated as a hero, Cary's jealousy grew darker with each passing year, until it exploded into the brutal murders of Carole Sund, Juli Sund, Silvina Pelosso, and Joie Ruth Armstrong. What drove a man from quiet lodge worker to cold-blooded killer? This is the chilling story of how envy turned into bloodshed. Cary Stayner's life began like many others in a quiet California town, but from an early age, he felt invisible. The Stayner family was struck by tragedy when his younger brother, Stephen, was kidnapped by a stranger and disappeared for years. The family's grief was heavy, but Cary's pain was different. While everyone mourned Stephen, Cary longed for attention that never came. When Stephen miraculously escaped and returned home as a teenager, the world celebrated him. Newspapers, television shows, and even neighbors praised his bravery. Cary, standing in the background, became a shadow in his own family's story. He was the older brother who never made headlines, the boy no one noticed. The praise showered on Stephen burned inside Cary, feeding resentment that only grew stronger as time passed. As Stephen's story spread across America, Cary struggled with feelings of inadequacy. He wanted recognition, but instead, he was overlooked. To him, Stephen was the center of everything, admired, loved, and treated as a symbol of survival. Cary felt abandoned in comparison. The bitterness did not fade. It hardened into anger. He masked it with silence, learning to suppress his emotions while watching his brother's story unfold. Family, friends, and strangers often spoke about how fortunate the Stayners were to have Stephen back, but no one asked how Cary felt. Each reminder of Stephen's heroism reminded Cary of his own obscurity. Behind his calm appearance, his mind began to twist with dangerous thoughts. The jealousy that once seemed like normal sibling rivalry became something much darker. He convinced himself that the only way to escape Stephen's shadow was through acts that would make the world notice him. What started as envy grew into a desire for control and recognition, a deadly hunger that would soon consume everything. By the late 1990s, Cary Stayner found himself working at a rustic lodge just outside Yosemite National Park, a place that drew thousands of tourists each year. Families came for the towering waterfalls, couples arrived for quiet getaways, and groups of friends explored the trails that stretched for miles. To outsiders, the lodge was a safe haven in the wilderness, a cozy retreat where travelers could rest before venturing deeper into the park's beauty. Cary blended into this environment, appearing as just another employee. He wore a polite smile, carried out his duties, and rarely drew attention to himself. Yet beneath the surface, Cary was unsettled. The quiet lodge surrounded by mountains only emphasized his inner storms. While others admired the breathtaking scenery, Cary felt suffocated by his own thoughts. The laughter of visitors echoed in his ears as a reminder of what he lacked: happiness, connection, and belonging. At night, when the halls emptied and the rooms grew still, Cary's imagination drifted into darker territories. He studied the guests with an intensity no one noticed, filing away details about who was alone, who seemed vulnerable, and who trusted the safety of the lodge too easily. The setting that inspired peace for so many became a hunting ground in his mind. The rustic cabins, with their thin walls and isolated locations, seemed to offer opportunity rather than refuge. Each check-in brought new faces, and with them, the possibility of satisfying the violent urges that grew inside him. Though no one suspected it, Cary was already rehearsing scenarios in his thoughts, picturing how he could turn this peaceful haven into a place of horror. The lodge, built to welcome weary travelers, was slowly becoming the stage for a nightmare waiting to unfold. In February of 1999, 3 visitors arrived at the Cedar Lodge near Yosemite. Carole Sund, a devoted mother, her teenage daughter Juli, and their family friend Silvina Pelosso had planned a brief but joyful trip. They were eager to take in the natural beauty of the mountains, to share time together before returning to their everyday lives. The women brought with them the kind of energy that lit up spaces, chatting easily with staff and making plans for the days ahead. To any other guest, they looked like just another happy group enjoying the park. But to Cary Stayner, they became something more. From the moment they checked in, Cary's attention sharpened. He noticed the warmth in their bond, the closeness between mother and daughter, and the easy friendship that tied them all together. To him, they represented everything he felt denied: love, unity, and a sense of belonging. Rather than admire these qualities, Cary's envy twisted them into a target. Each encounter fueled an idea that soon solidified into a plan. He began observing their patterns quietly: which times they left their room, how long they lingered outside, when they were most alone. The lodge should have been their sanctuary, a safe pause before returning to life's routines. But in Cary's mind, it transformed into a trap. The thin walls and isolated corridors gave him confidence that he could act without being stopped. What began as passing curiosity quickly grew into obsession. He convinced himself that their lives were no longer their own, but his to control. Unaware of the danger just beyond their door, the three women prepared for another night's rest, believing the mountains promised only peace. Cary, however, was already imagining the violence that would soon destroy them. One cold February night, Cary Stayner put his plan into motion. The three women inside their lodge room, Carole, Juli, and Silvina, had no reason to suspect that danger was approaching. Cary had studied their movements carefully, waiting for the moment when they were most vulnerable. With a chilling calmness, he entered their room. What unfolded was not impulsive but calculated, the result of days of silent observation. He moved with a control that belied the violence he was about to unleash. Carole, the mother, became his first focus. She tried to resist, but Cary's physical strength overpowered her. Silvina and Juli were forced into silence, watching in terror as the safety of their world shattered. The brutality was swift, but Cary carried it out with an eerie precision. To him, each act seemed like reclaiming a piece of the power he believed life had stolen from him. When the final moments came, the room that once held warmth and laughter was reduced to nothing but horror. Afterward, Cary turned his attention to covering his tracks. He thought carefully about how to handle the bodies, determined to confuse anyone who might investigate. He transported them away from the lodge, leaving them in places where he hoped nature and time would erase the evidence. He believed the remoteness of the mountains would work in his favor, concealing the truth long enough to let suspicion fall elsewhere. The following morning, guests awoke and began their vacations unaware of the crime that had taken place so close by. Detectives would soon be confronted with a baffling disappearance, but Cary returned to his duties at the lodge as though nothing had happened. His secret was buried in silence. Hidden beneath the calm surface, he showed the world. In the weeks following the triple murder, Cary Stayner slipped seamlessly back into his role at the Cedar Lodge. He changed sheets, carried supplies, and greeted guests with a quiet smile, as though nothing had happened. To those around him, he appeared steady, even dependable. The gruesome crime that shocked the region seemed to have left him untouched. Yet beneath the surface, Cary felt an intoxicating mix of fear and triumph. He had taken lives and walked away unseen. That sense of control fed the dark urges he had long struggled to contain. Investigators flooded the area, interviewing staff, guests, and locals. The disappearance of Carole, Juli, and Silvina dominated the news. Helicopters buzzed overhead, search teams combed the terrain, and reporters gathered outside the lodge. Cary answered questions politely, offering information that seemed helpful but revealed nothing. He watched the chaos he had caused with an eerie satisfaction, convinced that he had outsmarted everyone. The thought that authorities could be standing only feet from the killer never crossed their minds. Despite the outward calm, Cary's private world grew more unstable. Each night, the memory of his actions replayed in his mind, not with guilt, but with a perverse sense of accomplishment. The attention the case received in the media reignited old feelings of envy. He believed that his brother's story had once stolen the spotlight, but now, though no one knew it yet, the fear gripping the community belonged to him. The lodge, once a place of rest for travelers, now carried an unspoken tension. Guests whispered about the missing women, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Cary moved among them unnoticed, blending into the background. But deep inside, the urge that had driven him once was returning, stronger than before, demanding to be fed again. Months passed after the murders of Carole, Juli, and Silvina, but Cary Stayner's hunger for control did not fade. If anything, it grew more persistent, gnawing at him like an unrelenting shadow. He had convinced himself that the world owed him recognition, that each act of violence was a way to carve out the significance he had long been denied. It was during this restless time that he noticed Joie Ruth Armstrong, a naturalist working in Yosemite. She was young, vibrant, and full of passion for the wilderness around her. Unlike him, she seemed to live freely, unburdened by shadows of jealousy or resentment. To Cary, Joie represented everything he could never be. Her independence mocked his emptiness. Her energy made his bitterness sharper. Each time he saw her, the temptation grew. His twisted logic painted her not as a person, but as a symbol, something he needed to possess and ultimately destroy. He began to watch her movements with the same cold focus he had shown before, taking note of when she worked, where she walked, and how often she was alone. The park, a place Joie adored, became a hunting ground in Cary's mind. He rehearsed scenarios of how he might approach her, imagining the rush of power he would feel. Unlike the tourists who came and went, Joie belonged to the environment, her life deeply rooted in the park. That made her an even greater challenge, and therefore a greater prize. To those around him, Cary appeared unchanged, continuing his routine at the lodge without raising suspicion. But inside, his thoughts had already moved beyond the first killings. The urge to strike again had become unbearable. In Joie, he saw his next victim, the next step in the path of destruction he could no longer resist. On a warm July day in 1999, Cary Stayner put his plan into action. Joie Ruth Armstrong, the young naturalist, lived in a small cabin near Yosemite where she dedicated herself to environmental work. She spent her days teaching children about wildlife and guiding visitors along the park's hidden trails. To her, the cabin was a sanctuary, a place where she could rest after long hours outdoors. But to Cary, it was an isolated target, far from the safety of crowds and close enough for him to strike without interruption. He watched her movements carefully, waiting for the moment when she was alone. That moment came as she prepared to leave for a trip, her belongings scattered as she made her way to her vehicle. Cary approached with the same eerie calm he had shown before, masking the storm of impulses driving him. Within moments, Joie's routine day spiraled into terror. She was overpowered with shocking swiftness, stripped of the freedom she embodied. The attack was not chaotic but deliberate, carried out with the coldness of someone who had already rehearsed it in his mind. Cary ended her life and dragged her body into the wilderness she loved so deeply. The act was quick, but for him it carried the weight of triumph. He believed nature itself would hide his crime, that the trees, streams, and rugged terrain would work in his favor as a silent accomplice. For hours, the park remained oblivious to the horror concealed within its boundaries. Hikers passed by, children laughed nearby, and visitors marveled at the beauty of Yosemite, unaware that a predator had struck again. Cary walked away with his secret intact, convinced once more that he had succeeded in taking a life, while leaving behind nothing but silence. As the investigation into the Yosemite murders deepened, detectives began to re-examine everyone connected to the lodge and the surrounding area. Cary Stayner had already been interviewed in the earlier stages of the case, but his calm manner and cooperative answers had deflected suspicion. Still, investigators could not ignore that something about him seemed out of place. While most employees appeared rattled by the ongoing fear and attention, Cary remained oddly composed, almost detached from the panic that surrounded the lodge. Tips trickled in from the public, and one of them pointed directly toward Cary. A vehicle linked to him had been seen near Joie Armstrong's cabin around the time of her disappearance. What had once been a background presence suddenly became a possible lead. Detectives began noticing contradictions in his statements. He often claimed to be in one place, yet witnesses placed him somewhere else. The more they looked, the more cracks appeared in the mask he had carefully built. Meanwhile, Cary continued his routine, convinced that his intelligence and calmness would protect him. He believed investigators had no real evidence, that his careful planning had erased any chance of exposure. What he did not realize was that his very demeanor was drawing unwanted attention. To seasoned investigators, his lack of genuine emotion stood out like a warning sign. The lodge grew quieter as fear drove tourists away. Employees whispered about the possibility of a killer among them. Some suspected an outsider, while others secretly wondered if it could be someone close. For Cary, the walls were closing in. The confidence that had once sustained him began to waver, though he refused to admit it. Investigators were circling closer, and the carefully woven mask he wore was beginning to unravel. When Cary Stayner was finally brought in for questioning, investigators expected resistance. They anticipated evasive answers, denials, or perhaps even silence. Instead, they were met with something far more unsettling. Cary opened up quickly, almost eagerly, as though he had been waiting for this moment. With chilling composure, he began to recount the murders in vivid detail. He described how he entered the lodge room, how he subdued the women, and how he disposed of their bodies. His words lacked hesitation, each description flowing as if rehearsed. Detectives listened in disbelief as the truth unraveled directly from the killer himself. What shocked them most was not just the confession, but the attitude behind it. Cary showed no remorse, no hint of sorrow for the lives he had taken. Instead, he seemed almost proud, explaining that killing gave him the sense of control he had long craved. He admitted his jealousy toward his brother Stephen, revealing how the constant comparisons had driven him deeper into resentment. While Stephen had been celebrated as a survivor and a hero, Cary felt invisible, forced to watch from the sidelines. His crimes, he explained, were a way to step into the spotlight in his own twisted way. The confession stunned investigators. They had expected a difficult battle to prove his guilt, but Cary himself had removed all doubt. His cold honesty left little room for interpretation. The man who had once blended into the background of the lodge now stood exposed as the predator who had terrorized Yosemite. The ease with which he spoke about the killings revealed a darkness few could comprehend. For those in the room, it became clear that Cary Stayner's motive was not only envy but a hunger for recognition at any cost. Cary Stayner's arrest and confession marked the end of a reign of terror, but the aftermath left wounds that could never fully heal. Families of the victims were left with unbearable grief, their lives forever altered by his actions. Yosemite, once a place associated with beauty and wonder, carried the stain of fear and tragedy. Tourists hesitated to return, and the lodge where Cary had worked became a symbol of betrayal, a reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. In court, Cary faced trial for the murders. The evidence, combined with his own detailed confession, left no room for doubt. Jurors listened as prosecutors painted the portrait of a man consumed by jealousy and rage, a man who had turned his private bitterness into violence. The defense attempted to argue mental instability, but the cold precision of his crimes made it clear that Cary had acted with intent. He was sentenced to death, his fate sealed in a courtroom that echoed with the pain of those he had destroyed. The story of Cary Stayner became one of the most disturbing chapters in true crime history. It revealed how envy, left unchecked, can corrode the mind until nothing but darkness remains. While his brother Stephen had endured unimaginable suffering and emerged as a symbol of survival, Cary chose a path of destruction. The contrast between the two brothers was stark, one celebrated for his resilience, the other infamous for his brutality. In the end, Cary Stayner achieved the recognition he had long desired, but not in the way he once imagined. His name would be remembered, not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale of jealousy, rage, and the devastating consequences of letting bitterness rule a life.